My name is Brigitta, and I identify as two-spirited. I'm Indigenous. My nation is Mohawk and Métis. I like making medicine bags, like the one you see I'm wearing. Try to stay in touch with my traditions as much as I can. That's what I do.
My name is Arij Riahi. I am a criminal defense lawyer. I've been practicing since 2014, and I've worked mainly around profiling issues. So racial profiling mostly, but also worked around social and political profiling.
My name is Jessica Quijano. I have been a community frontline worker for about 18 years. I currently am a coordinator for a project called the Ishku Project at the Native Women's Shelter of Montreal. The majority of the people I interact with are Inuit from different parts of northern Quebec. I also work with a lot of Indigenous women and trans and two-spirit people from across the country that might be coming to Montreal, and also a lot of urban Indigenous people that are here. I also work with girls that are in care, because there are a significant amount that are run away from the system who might, be leaving the foster care system and they're declared missing.
I'm from Montreal, born and raised, and still here. I am of Trinidadian descent on my mother's side, and from the Central African Republic on my father's side. I work part-time managing my own private practice as a clinical counselor, and then I work part-time as a SAGEP instructor in psychology at Champlain, and I work part-time as an EDI or EDIA consultant. So right now I'm contracted with a company in Ontario, in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and then I also, I guess you can call it content development. So I design workshops, trainings, facilitated discussions, educational guides. I do guest speaking too, so TV, radio, podcasts, Facebook Live events, discussion panels, just kind of like a mixed bag.
The main thing is definitely the youth in the streets. A lot of the youth I represented have used the word harassment to talk about their interaction with the police. And it is a pretty heartbreaking narrative, because the question that is presented to me in most cases, whether my client is Indigenous or a Black person, why is it that my presence in the public space escalates things? Sometimes they don't even have to say something specific. Sometimes it's a behavior that is perceived by the police as an attack or a question on their authority.
I have to be fair. Not all my interactions with police have been bad. I've had interactions with the police, whether it's randomly, whether it's planned, where it's been incredibly helpful and supportive, been exactly what my interaction with the police should be. And so I'm always cognizant of the fact that a few experiences do not determine the identity of an entire group, and I think I'd be hypocritical as a person of color or as a Black man to then take that position, knowing the ills of that and the problems that can create. So I do have to be fair about that. Understanding racism within a society and understanding the shift of focusing on racism in terms of systems of oppression, in terms of institutional control and legal authority, right? I think you walk around with that and it has its own weight, but then I think also knowing that for a lot of people, because of what people they know or loved ones or themselves have experienced, there's just this automatic response of threat or feeling threatened, or anxiety.
I've only had a few incidents with systematic racism from the police. I got attacked once and the police yelled at me in French, knowing that I didn't speak it, and made fun of me and called me a savage, and I got pretty pissed and I spat in the cop's face. And then I got arrested and released the next day. I've had a lot of run-ins with the police in Ontario, being Indigenous. I've had friends that are Indigenous, the Mohawk community, and other especially my friends in Toronto that are Anishinaabe. One of my friends was in an incident with his girlfriend, and the police assumed because he was Indigenous that he was a drunk, and they tried to accuse him of being intoxicated in public. And I came to his, I tried to have his back, and the police tried to arrest me. And so this is it happens a lot in Indigenous communities. They basically think and assume because we're Indigenous that we're either gang involved, drug involved, alcohol abusing, we're violent. But it's not that. It's sometimes when I see police, I just spit on their cars. I'm angry, I'm pissed. They don't scare me. They just make me nervous and they make me uncomfortable, and I don't fucking trust them at all. Whenever I have a problem, I don't call them. I never call them for help anymore because they're useless and they don't care.
You're always shaking down people on the street. I see you doing things all the time, but now I actually need you to go do that. And because they have access to a lot of technology, I think that here, specifically in Quebec, there's very little education about Indigenous issues, about the history of colonization, and also that there's an ongoing colonization today. Because of that lack of education, people don't necessarily understand the different challenges that Indigenous women, trans two-spirit people have when they arrive in Montreal, which is very different here than it would be in another city, or if you're talking about communities outside of Montreal. I think that the language is a really important barrier for a lot of Indigenous people who come here because they might have never learned French. Their mother tongue might not be English. So it's I work with a lot of women who their mother tongue is Inuktitut. I think that if it's really important when you're doing this kind of work, especially myself, as an ally to the community, to be well educated and decolonize a lot of the practices that we often will have been taught. I completely believe that Indigenous people do not need anyone else for them to have their sovereignty, to have their land back. We talk about the residential school system, the 60 scoop, and so forth. There is not one single Indigenous person who's not affected by residential schools. I also work with young people, teenagers, and they're affected by residential schools, even though they haven't gone to residential schools. Either their parents went to residential school. When you remember, the last residential school was closed in 1996. Okay, so I have people my age that went to residential school. So that is very fresh. There has not been adequate reparations that have been paid out. The court system fighting Indigenous children to this day. We're talking about, in parts of the country where almost 80% of children in foster care are Indigenous. If you look at areas like Manitoba, it's the same thing here.
So harassment can look like the police officer knowing your name, your first name, and where you hang out, and what's your job. And that can be a sign of maybe police being integrated, so to speak, in a community. But if it's used as a scare tactic, then that leaves a lot of damages. So if a police officer is just basically driving by and screaming the first name of someone as if they are friends, that is in and of itself terrorizing for some people. Receiving a lot of tickets for basically being alive in public. That is a big problem. In Montreal, there are some tickets that are the legislation. I think society should look into these pieces of legislation, regulations from the city of Montreal, and I think we need data about how it is actually used, in which neighborhood, and who is targeted the most with these specific city regulations. So for example, being loud in the streets, anything related to obstruction of a police officer. I think it would be very hard to have a colorblind analysis of that. Being out in the park too late, past certain hours. So there's everything around small policing, the inner perspective of my client. What is relayed to me is that question of what is it about me that is so threatening?
Pam Palmater, who wrote a kind of I guess it was a research on police in Canada and how there's so many cases of sexual assault against Indigenous women. And she's completely 100% right.
I had to spend a night in jail in the remand center, and then I got a assault charge for something I didn't even do. So they basically asked me, they even asked me if I was Indian. I'm like, no, I'm not Indian. I'm Indigenous, I'm Native. And they're like, well, and then you should be drunk. I'm like, are you kidding me? This guy, I tried to put like a no contact order. It didn't go through. They never even gave me a paper. This is what I'm talking about. When a Native woman goes missing, they don't even take action. They don't care. It's like, it's so bad. That's why I don't live there, because it's dangerous. The police there don't take nothing serious. They do an investigation and just leave it in freaking some like stack of paper somewhere on someone's desk. They don't take action. It could have been me many times.
He tried to conceptualize a little bit racial profiling, what it looks like, and he put forward this recipe. Racial profiling works best in places where there is high discretion in police power but low visibility. So if, for example, a police officer hands out a small ticket that is worth a less than $100 fine, that ticket is rather small. If someone receives it and that person have the means to pay, but they don't have the means to pay a lawyer, well, financially speaking, the decision is easy to take. I'll just pay that ticket and move on. But what if that happens the next week? And what if that happens every month? And what if that has been happening since the last few years? And what if at some point, then it's not you, it's your friend? And what if that police officer recognizes you when you're driving your girlfriend's car? And you have a very ethnic name, but your girlfriend is Québécois. Then they pull you aside to make sure that you can drive this car. So it's, in French we use the word engrenage, and that's a bit of the domino effect of all of this.
Like, I joke, and I'm also serious when people have asked if you ever had any negative encounters by the police or been profiled, discriminated against, and I laugh, and I was like, obviously, because it's become a rite of passage here, unfortunately, for people of color, in particular the Black community, and that's unfortunate, right? Like, being abused or hurt or mistreated, or a constant and regular experience of injustice, or being othered, or being deemed as less than human, or treated or made to feel that way, and then no one listening to you. And it doesn't matter how frequent, it doesn't matter the quantity of instances or the quality of instances, if you want to put it that way, that it doesn't matter because you're still not being heard or it's still being denied. I think you see more and more awareness.
I witnessed an incident at the metro, this BIPOC trans woman, Black trans woman, getting attacked by the STM. They were hitting her in the face, punching her, treating her like crap, and it really made me angry. I was there and I witnessed the whole fucking thing. I tried to get involved and help her. I tried to go and grab her out of the hands of the STM, and the guy pushed me. And I kicked him, and I got arrested for assault because I was trying to help this trans woman from getting beat up.
Wow.
The Montreal police, I saw everything. I tried to film it on my phone, and they took my iPhone and they threw it on the tracks.
Wow.
I just couldn't fucking believe what I saw. The images stick in my mind like all the time because of what I witnessed. This whole thing went all over the media. Nobody wants to do anything about it. These police are getting taxed. People are paying for the cops. They're paying for the STM, and they're paying for brutality. They're paying for transphobia. They're paying for racism, and it doesn't stop. And what's it gonna take to end? Like, what are we doing as people?
What the plan the government had to eliminate all Indigenous people is actually continuing that, because we see rates of homicide of Indigenous women of 25% when they represent less than 3% of the population. We're talking about a population, 40% in some areas of the country, of Indigenous women in prison. They're often there for murdering their partners in self-defense. Men, Indigenous men, is 25% of the population. We're talking about a population that is less than 5%. There's areas of the east on the East Coast in Mi'kmaq communities where 80% of the prison are Indigenous men. So I think that we often have this disconnect in Canada. We think that the U.S., when we talk about the Black community being over-incarcerated, doesn't happen here, but we have the exact same issues. Our prisons are filled with Indigenous women and men that are Black and brown. That's what our prison system is, and they represent a small percentage of the population.
Racism is a continuum, and in the systemic racism around the legal system, that is also a continuum. And street harassment is the most visible form of it. So access to justice, being able to hire a lawyer to defend your rights, is definitely a big issue. This is an area where we definitely need data. The past 10, 15 years, there's an increasing number of articles from social sciences and from academia in the legal sphere. There is increasing number of studies that tell us that systemic racism is an issue everywhere, including in the legal system, including in the criminal justice system. But specifically in the criminal justice system, it is all over the criminal justice system. There's a problem of systemic racism. What I mean by that is that it starts with surveillance. Not every neighborhood in Montreal is being surveilled the same way, and that it's not every neighborhood in Montreal receives the same resources in terms of policing as well. So it starts with surveillance, but then you have the number of tickets, the number of criminal charges being actually pressed against certain communities. And then you have overrepresentation. So we start getting into what we call now the cliches, but they weren't maybe 10 years ago. So the cliches of overrepresentation of some communities in prison, in the penitentiaries, especially Black and Indigenous people, and increasingly now the Latinx community, and as well as people from the of Arabic/Muslim origins. Racial profiling is one part of the profiling problem. I think that profiling is a three-headed beast. So there's the social, the political, and racial profiling. With racial profiling, they put in writing the early thoughts, the legal concepts around racial profiling in French in Quebec with the work of Michel Turenne, and here is why. The origin of racial profiling is a policy, a strategy that comes from the Drug Enforcement Agency in the United States. So this strategy is basically a policing method, and the goal was to identify current or potential drug dealers. Operation Pipeline focused on the origin of the drug dealers. The link between Operation Pipeline and what's going on here in Canada is the training that the police officer receive. And according to the documents from la Commission de la Personne, Commission des droits de la personne et de la jeunesse, there's a direct line to be drawn. So it is impossible to have a racial profiling conversation without naming who are its victims, and basically Black communities, Indigenous communities, increasingly in Canada, although that reality may not be present the same way in the United States, but also the Latinx communities, and increasingly Arab/Muslim.
Like, I went to a vigil yesterday of one of the women I knew for a long time on the street, Elisa P. Putaluk. She was in her 60s and she froze to death last week.
There was someone that I didn't know in the Indigenous community that just passed away. Her name is Elisa. And her body was found in a fucking construction site. And it took the cops like 3 hours to get to her after she was found dead. And I knew her, and she did have her run-ins because she did have a lot of pain that she didn't know how to cope with. And at certain times I would be with her, and one time we were together, the police stopped her in the metro station in Atwater because she was intoxicated, and I was just trying to get her to a safe place, and they kept questioning her. And I kept saying, listen, I know her, I'll just take her home. And they kept trying to say they wanted to take her to the drunk tank. I said, no, I'm fucking taking her home.
And this happens every winter. We lost like 14 women last year just in this area. And she was kicked out of the metro. And she died under a construction site for the condos right up the street from right near where we are.
So I had to argue with the police on that, and they finally gave in and let me take her. And that was the last time I saw her alive. And I found out she was dead. The Inuit community get a lot of harassment from the police at Atwater Station. A few occasions, near Resilience. I've witnessed the staff at Resilience found behind the Atwater Metro froze to death because they turned him away for a bed in the warming tent because he was drunk. It don't matter if you're drunk or sober, you deserve a safe place to sleep at night so you don't die. They're going through some hard times and they're drinking or using, and that's the main reason why that place has turned them away.
Advocating, for example, like I will advocate for like an Indigenous teen girl to go back into her community. It's really unfortunate we lock up children when they are dealing with trauma for running away. They actually go into lockdown units. It's a bias, right? Because we don't treat white teenagers in that same way. We see it all the time, like even in the media, like Janai, who was stabbed in Côte-des-Neiges compared to the boy in the East End. The media response hasn't been the same. I just see how much more forgiving the system is towards, like, because I have worked in many, many different systems, towards like a white teenager compared to an Indigenous girl dealing with her trauma and might be running away, and the response is to, you know, treat them as criminals and put them in, you know, juvenile prisons. I have seen over the 18 years, seeing people in foster care end up homeless and in prison. So it's just a continuation, and it's really a continuation of a genocide. This is actually really intentional by the government. Like, my project shouldn't even exist. You know, there shouldn't be someone having to tell the police to look for an Indigenous girl or woman. But it does, because the community won't go do a police report. I will do the police report. I keep their confidentiality, and we're able to locate people. So, because that's all that's available. It's been very, very eye-opening for me, just the amount of surveillance Indigenous women, for example, get in the city. And it's like, the study that just came out like not too long ago, Indigenous women were profiled the most out of anyone. And those are the women I work with by police that get ticketed and profiled. 40% of tickets here in Montreal by the SPVM are given to homeless people. It's like we pretty much are policing poverty. You know, that's all we're doing. And it absolutely leads to nothing. It's a waste of money. Those tickets actually never get paid. If people don't have a home, they're going to obviously take up space, and rightfully so. If we talk about Indigenous people we are in unceded Mohawk territory as we speak, you know, until there's actual reparations and real reconciliation, people have the right to exist in public spaces.
It doesn't really matter where you're coming from. It doesn't really matter what is your identity. At the end of the day, what matters is, what did the police officer perceive? If they perceive you to be an immigrant, then it doesn't matter if you are or not. Because you're coming from this specific background, we conclude that you have a higher chance of being involved in this criminal activity. To say it in very crude terms, to use the example of Islam, to say it in very crude terms, not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims. That is the bias at the end of the day, is a police officer perceiving that you come from this specific group and associate that with criminal activity. Basically, oh, I perceive you to belong to this community, and then I make a decision based on what I perceive. And if that decision is, I think something is weird with you, then that's profiling. Implicit bias is a big part of it. But implicit bias can happen in the street with the patrol. Perhaps implicit bias can slowly, with decision making and policy making, morph into strategies to target crime specifically. The conversation about les gangs de rue in Montreal is a clear example of that. There is so much around policing in Montreal that, keeping in mind the problem of the gang de rue, but the numbers don't really match. Same thing with the financing. There's definitely a lot of questions to be asked about who can police who at the end of the day. Why is it that we are not able to at least recruit from inside the communities? Why is this problem still existing?
I've had sex workers that have died that I knew because of bad dates, and the police refused to help them because they were Black or Indigenous and even trans. This is the issue we go through every day, and it continues to happen in Toronto. It happens in Montreal. It happens all over Canada. How many women do we have to lose in our community before it stops? It should stop right now. And this is like what I don't understand. Like, I don't even, men especially, I don't want to sound like a sexist, but I don't even feel safe meeting some men because they would have experienced the trauma that I've went through when I was a sex worker, when I was homeless, and friends that I've lost that were sex workers. They scare the shit out of me. I don't trust a lot of them, you know. The police arrested a trans woman in Toronto and she ended up having a heart attack and dying in the car. Okay, like, they should have been sent to jail for that. But did they go? No, of course they did not go, because they're the system. I probably would have went to jail for a long time. But did they? No, of course not. Because they're the system. That's the problem. They're in control.
People are afraid, rightfully so, because you don't know how it's going to end up. And look, 70% of police killings are mental health crises. If you look at Nicholas Gibbs, Pierre Corey-Allan, those are like just a recent in Montreal that were killed by the SPVM, Sheffield Matthews, all mental health crises. And those men would be alive, I know, if we would have had a different response.
Homeless people die constantly in Montreal, and it just feels like the police could have easily helped this woman that passed away, and this man that froze to death, and me. I had to help myself get off the streets. I called the ambulance for many people that I found almost dying of overdoses of fentanyl, and the cops just don't do shit. They do target the sex workers, and they do target people like the marginalized community. Of course they do, because they never experienced it in their lives. They never been through that. They never had broken homes. They never been an addict. They never been homeless. The majority of police in Montreal are white. I don't see one Native cop. I don't see one Black cop, not once. Why? Because they're racist. A lot, especially in Montreal. I've seen it.
Why are certain things in our society criminalized? Why is loitering criminalized? Why is sleeping in public or urinating, when we know the root causes is housing? It's a real discrimination. Like, what are people supposed to do if they don't have a home? They do the things that we do, but on the street. The women I work with they might be working in the sex trade or they might be working in the drug trade. And that's one of the reasons why police is always in their life. And then you put on layers of, them being homeless, sleeping on benches, drinking in public. All of those bylaws by the city should be taken away because they're discriminatory. $740 million to police when we could be providing homes, when the majority of the tickets is to the homeless population. So it's less than 1% that police respond to actual violence. I don't think police should be responding to mental health crises. I don't think they should be responding to domestic violence. I don't think they should be responding to overdoses. Actually, people don't call 911 because they know the police are gonna show up, so people are dying right now. It should be an ambulance. Like I often go on calls on situations of conjugal violence or intimate partner violence because the people I work with, they don't trust the police when they're there because they shoot Indigenous and sometimes it's an Indigenous, it could be like an Indigenous woman and a Black man or an Indigenous man or a white man or whatever the situation is. I show up there and their approach is opposite of what you do for de-escalation. It's the complete opposite. And even to the point where I've even seen situations where they arrest the victim because she might have outstanding warrant for something like just not showing up for court because of possession charges or something ridiculous. So she's calling 911 because her life is in danger, and then you're arresting her. So you cannot trust police in intervening in these situations. And I'm very confident that we can do this work without police because we're already doing it. I already intervene in all these situations, mental health and overdoses and like all these situations. We already do, my colleagues and myself. We're just very, very underfunded. We don't have we just have not even a fraction of what the police have as resources. So imagine if we had just some of it.
The problem around profiling racism and gang de rue in Montreal is to read Robin Maynard's book, Policing Black Lives. That has a lot of information, a lot of examples, names, situations. Gang-related crime in Montreal is not the most popular crime. How much money was poured in the war against street gangs, how many policing decisions are articulated around that issue, while it does not represent the reality. It's what you see, but it also informs where you look. And so if you keep looking at a community, of course you will find higher numbers of criminal activity. Of course you will find those statistics because the focus of your data is that specific community. It magnified existing problems. And I feel this is, maybe there's consensus in the community sector about the fact that the pandemic exaggerated or made worse current situations. Not everybody can afford to take the legal case seriously. People have concerns, can I stay in the city? Should I leave? If I leave, where do I go? Access to justice has multiple layers, and access to a lawyer is definitely one layer. Access to a lawyer that understands where you're coming from is, I think, a luxury right now. And that has to do with all the problems related that exist currently about access to justice. That's one half of it. The other half is representation. Being a lawyer requires a lot of work, and we definitely need more lawyers from different communities. But I feel requires a certain set of privileges, and your life being stable is one of them. Because there's an increasing number of people who are eligible to legal aid, especially for marginalized communities, but the legal aid does not, most cases in municipal court, most racial profiling happens in situation of high discretion, low visibility. That takes us to municipal court in Montreal. Municipal court in Montreal would be a rather small criminal case. That's $300, regardless of the amount of work that you did. So if your motivation is mostly financial because you have a family to feed, what is the incentive if you're getting $300 at the end of the day, whether you work hard or you don't? That is a problem.
Of police check data, while also noting that some searches were conducted but unreported by municipal police force. The report ultimately reflects a lack of policy rather than a problem with racial profiling. According to the 164-page document, Black and Indigenous people living in Montreal are 4 to 5 times more likely to experience random street checks by police officers, and Arab Montrealers are twice as likely to be stopped. But Indigenous women make up the demographic most targeted by police, stopped 11 times more often than any racialized group.
People I work with, they believe the messages that they're being told, like that it's my fault. Like when I talk to them about, the police brutalize them, well, it's my fault, I shouldn't be on the street, maybe I should stop using. So those messages of how they're criminal is very much stigmatized in them. They see themselves as the problem because that's the message they've been told since they're very, very young. And especially I work with a lot of people who have been criminalized from very, very early age, that have gone in through the foster care system. And when you're treated as subhuman, you're not like human, you start to believe it. So their mental health is not well. The system continuously adds more post-traumatic stress to people I work with. Every time you arrest someone, throw them in prison, you've just added another trauma. You just continuously, and prison does not give you any kind of rehabilitation, there's no support. So the mental health, I've seen people sadly deteriorate. Like when I've seen people in the 18 years are young and, are like in their early 20s, and now I see them close to their 40s, and they've actually been in and out of prison many, many times. Their mental health has deteriorated. I've seen people go from even using more drugs and alcohol, having enormous amount of health issues. Over the years, I've seen many people die, like really, that could have been preventable. So, I mean, it's very difficult for the people to witness that, right? Yeah, so, yeah.
Everyone deserves that, whether they're homeless or not. People deserve to be taken care of and treated with respect and dignity, because that's common sense, to be nice to people that deserve it. But even if they don't deserve it, I'd still help them, because I've been where they were. I've been homeless. I've been asking for change before. It's not fun. But first, the system needs to be a little bit more nicer to people. And the police need to fuck off. I'm tired of the racism. I'm tired of homeless people suffering. I'm tired of homeless people dying. I'm tired of Indigenous women going missing and the police not doing anything about it. I'm tired of Black people getting, attacked by the police. I'm tired of just the nonsense and the drama. I just want everything to be okay. That's my hope for this world and for the system and just for society. I hope it happens one day, because if it doesn't happen, things are gonna get bad. And people are gonna riot. Again and again and again. That's it. You know what I mean? It just needs to change.
And police power is a problem. I'm very interested in the criminal charge of obstruction. I think there is missing data on how obstruction, a criminal charge, is used. Who gets charged with obstruction the most often? How many of obstruction cases see the light of day in court? How many obstruction cases fall apart at the last minute because charges are withdrawn the day before the trial? Which neighborhood gets the most tickets for being alive in public? It's how they are applied. And when a policy allows a lot of room for maneuver to the police officer, when a policy, a regulation allows for a lot of discretion in how police power is handled, that's where it can start to be problematic, and that's the data that we need. Perhaps it would be okay to have another protocol. Perhaps it would be okay for the dispatcher or the person receiving the call to have access to a social worker, to have access to a counselor, to have access to someone that is trained in de-escalating a crisis. Perhaps the de-escalation skill in the form of a person can be there with them. So when the police show up, they also show up with a community member. They show up with someone trained in mental illness, serving Black communities. Maybe show up with someone that comes from the same region as the person in front of you. If we're talking about Indigenous people in homelessness situations in Montreal, perhaps have a translator on hand. I think it's impossible for the police officer that's doing the patrol in the streets to keep in mind everything. And so perhaps more help should be organized, and it should be tailored according to the situation that they have in front of them and how that person identifies themselves. If you don't have stable housing, of course you're gonna be going through a crisis if something happened during your day. And yeah, why is it that no one can fix this? And I wish I had the answer. I feel like we don't have the data. We have the experiences, but we don't have the data. The data is important to convince outside of our communities. The data is important to convince those that are unconvinced by narratives and by repeated experiences and by general consensus that this exists and this is a problem and we've been dealing with this. If we manage to develop data and show how it works on paper, then perhaps we would be able to develop global approaches. Right now, it's a little bit of piecemeal approaches. Everybody's doing their own thing, but it doesn't translate into a global approach, a global response to this. And racial profiling, I think, goes beyond the criminal justice system. Healthcare system is entirely as complicated and different conversation. Policing happens with the criminal justice system, but it can also happen on school ground. Who gets the most remarks about hair and the way you wear your pants? So it's a multifaceted problem. We can see its symptoms and manifestation in different parts of society, but the piecemeal approach to this, with every part of society trying to figure out what to do on their own, I find is bound to fail. We need a conversation around the criminal justice system and attach that to a conversation around the healthcare system and attach that to a conversation around schools and academia. Yeah, would inform, guide a global approach down the line. Because the problem is in how it is applied.
Black individuals who suffer with mental health issues and how they've been treated by the police or so. And again, it's not all, but you hear this and you're inundated with this time and time again, and then you have your own experiences, then you have the experiences of people that you know who might be siblings or classmates or co-workers or family members. And then there's such a mass amount of it that you carry that with you, that shapes you. Even biologically, we have things called mirror neurons that allow us to take on the emotions of the outside world. Kind of like in the same way, if you see an awkward moment in TV, and you're like, oh, it's really uncomfortable. So to that end, even that is traumatizing or rewiring us, making our central response systems highly sensitized and overactive. And that weighs on us. And then it's not just the mental health toll, it's the emotional toll. If you're constantly guarded and have a barrier up, how does that affect your own relationships, your ability to work, your peace of mind? Then physiologically, living the dangers of living under extreme and regular, constant, unpredictable stress. High blood pressure, which we all know affects the Black community in particular. Hypertension, right? There's a lot more, but all these things that can come and play into it just because of living in a world or a reality of constant threat, or feeling that you have to be guarded, not just, and it's everything, whether it's the police, whether it's, those little unclear, ambiguous moments where you don't know what's constantly playing on in there. I explained it to my friend, do you know what it's like to not have certainty or clarity about 60-something% of your experiences, never knowing why that person crossed the street, or things like that, and or noticing that somebody says hi to everybody else who goes into a store, and yet when you say hi to them, they don't, and not knowing why. and you can't go all to the extreme of being it's clearly this, but you can't go to the extreme of saying it's clearly not. That weighs on you. Anyways, yeah.